entrance in. Ok, c'est mon retour là. Ja.
In it, it didn't work like that. It literally took 600 years to create all of the architecture that we see around us. And they concentrated their monastery and the building up here. They did use all of the island, and actually you passed whole sections today that you probably didn't even see because it meshes into the colour of the rock. But they would have used the entire island. They had 3 stairways down to the sea, and they had sections of stairs in places we don't fully even understand the reason for. So just bear that in mind. Today when we come as visitors, we're very cautious and careful, and we stick to the designated pathways. But of course these men were used to clambering and climbing all over the island. Now, they were never a huge group. The island itself couldn't support a massive amount of people out here. But they did tend to set up in numbers of 13. This was a holy number because it mirrored Christ and the 12 apostles. So you had the abbot who was in charge and 12 monks beneath him. And you're wondering what took anybody 9 miles off the mainland to a pretty inhospitable island. You're probably thinking, it's not exactly the perfect place to build a monastery in. And yet somehow these men decided this is exactly where we need to be. And the reason they chose this island was because these men, they weren't attached to any known order like we think of today when we're familiar with what a monk is. They were independent men who shared similar ideals, and they knew how they wanted to live their lives. They wanted to copy the lifestyle of the very first monks, the desert fathers who went off into the desert of Egypt, people like St. Anthony. And they actually would have had copies of the lives of those saints, and they would have studied them every day. And in their own way, they tried to replicate that type of hermit existence. So obviously, what began to happen around the 6th century is little monasteries began to appear all along the islands on the west coast of this country, and sometimes even in islands in the centre of lakes on the mainland, or in heavily wooded areas or mountainous areas. Small little communities like this one began to spring up, and that's why out here they could cut themselves off from society and they could immerse themselves in nature. And that was very important because in this early Christian period, God was very much seen in the spirit of creatures like birds and insects and flowers. It was very important to be immersed in nature, and out here they were able to do that, cut themselves off from society and live a difficult lifestyle. And hardship was seen as a form of prayer, and they would have felt closer to God living a difficult lifestyle. So this was actually the perfect place to build this type of monastery. And out they came in the late 6th century, and that first group must have been very, very brave, because they came to an island that no one had previously lived on. There's no evidence that anybody lived here before the monks. And the reason for that is most likely because there's no natural water source or spring on the island. So from day one, the monks that came here had to collect rainwater in order to survive, and they didn't know if you could survive out here. So in the beginning they would have settled in temporary shelters and things like that to see if you could actually exist in this environment. And then over time they decided yes, it's possible, and they chose a permanent base to settle and build a monastery on, which is right here. And they were very, very clever about the way in which they used what was available to them out here. There was very little here, and yet what was here was used very cleverly. So they decided to build a monastery on a south-facing slope, so we get the maximum amount of sunlight at this side of the island, which was a very clever idea, because they also grew vegetables in the lower garden terrace, the one beneath us. That's always traditionally been known as the monk's garden. And it's like a little sun trap out there. So if you're having your picnic out today, you know, that's a nice place to picnic. It gets really, really warm, and it's really sheltered. It's really sheltered because they built this monastery in such a way that you're actually protected from the main weather fronts and the winds that blow in here. Our main weather comes off the southwest, the prevailing winds. And there are lots of days during summer when visitors come, and it's almost impossible to climb the steps. Some days you're actually climbing underneath the wind to get up. It's very, very difficult. The moment you walk into the terrace outside, it's suddenly incredibly sheltered and easy to move around. And that's because the wind actually hits the wall of the terrace and rises over the monastery. So you're really sheltered and protected in here. It was very, very clever. And the walls of the terrace have a very important original function in that they hold up two huge man-made terraces. The ground beneath our feet has been built by the monks. The island itself falls naturally off. You probably saw the shape of it when you looked up from your boat. But a massive amount of work went into creating two man-made terraces, this one and the one beneath us. They quarried so much rock from this side of the island, from the bedrock behind us here, that they actually dramatically changed the shape of the island at this side. And the majority of the work, when you look around the monastery and the island today, went into creating the terraces rather than the actual structures on top. They didn't have any flat, sheltered space of land to build on this island. The word Skellig itself means craggy rock. So they had to create these flat spaces in the forms of these terraces. And they very cleverly designed it so that it was possible to do so. And they built two water cisterns to collect the rainwater up here. There's one just underneath this beehive here. There's another cistern underneath the terrace steps that lead up there. There's about 100 gallons of water in the two of those, and they're full. You can see today if you look in, they're absolutely full. I wouldn't advise you to put your hand in because they're full of algae and they would be stagnant. But there's no shortage of rain, and basically what the monks did is they just channeled the rainwater that flows naturally off the bedrock behind us. And then they cut channels that run underneath the beehive huts themselves and drain into those cisterns. So they had a proper water supply. So they really were very, very clever at using what was available to them. Then they also would have kept sheep and goats on the island, and there was wild goats still here up until the 50s. And they also would have fished the sea naturally enough. And they tried to preserve anything they caught by smoking it or salting it. And this beehive up here is one of the larger two of all of the beehives you're looking at. And it's one of the two that had a fire in it, and also a loft feature. And we believe it may have been used as a smokehouse to smoke the fish that they caught. They had 3 stairways down to the sea, as I mentioned earlier. You came up the south steps today, which are original. But when you looked up from your boat, you may have noticed a very, very steep staircase on the eastern side of the island that you were probably praying you didn't have to climb up yourselves. That's the most direct access. And they had another stairway on the northern side of the island. And what it meant is that if it was blowing a gale at this side, it's nice and sheltered down the northern side. So they had not grown on the island. And also the fuel for their fires, wood and turf, that all had to come from over there. So there was a lot of movement over and back. And it's possibly one of the reasons that not all of these beehives had fires inside in them. Now, today's a pet day, you know, for September, especially in this country. You know, it's normally very damp and very wet, this side of the world. And now, we're ice-free for most of the winter down here. It's very rare that you get a very cold winter. But it's always damp and wet. And they were living in very wet, damp conditions most of their lives. And yet still, they did not all have fires in them. And sometimes we know from other monasteries similar to this one that they choose not to have fires in them because, again, that uncomfortable living, that hardship was seen as a form of prayer that could be offered up, and they felt they would be closer to God living these difficult lifestyles. Now, on top of the grain that they needed and things like that, there was one other thing that the island itself could provide for their diet, and that was the birds. And the seabirds that nest here were very important in the diet of the monks. Today, there's very few birds left on the island. There's a few nocturnal species that are still nesting, but the majority of the other birds have fledged. But it's a very important puffin colony, and I'm sure everybody knows what a puffin is. You would have seen them on the mainland on all the postcards and everything to do with here. It's always a little puffin bird you'll see. A little black and white creature with a coloured beak. There's about 6,000 of them nesting on the island, and they're true seabirds. They only come in March and stay to the very first week in August. They just come here to lay an egg and to raise their young. They will spend the entire rest of the time out in the North Atlantic, and our puffins go as far as the waters off Canada. And for such a small bird, they're quite long-lived. They live to be 30. The ones we've ringed out here have been over 30. They take a partner for life, and they come back to this very same burrow every year with the same partner and have one little chick called a puffling. And they raise him, and once their job is done for the summer, they go off and they go about their business in early August back to sea. But these birds were hugely important for the monks living here as well, because they were easy to harvest. They were easy to get at. They didn't have to climb down a cliff face and risk their lives to get at eggs. They literally just had to pop their hands into the burrows, and you would have passed all the burrows along the pathway. If you were here in the puffin season, all the puffin birds are actually standing on the stairway as the visitors pass. The ones on this side of the island have a memory, and they come back to the same spot every year, so they know that the tourists don't harm them, and they let you get really, really close to them to take pictures and things. They are incredible, and it is something that's as special as what you're seeing today. So a lot of time people try and get here during the puffin season. But these birds, the eggs were important, and also there's a nice bit of flesh on the breast of them, which were important for the monks. And their feathers would have been very useful. They would have used them as bedding, but also they may have even used them as a commodity to trade for things they needed, like wine for the Eucharist. That had to be brought in, they needed that. So again, the puffin feathers would have been really, really useful for that. So for the most part, they used everything that was available to them on this island to try and survive out here. Now, throughout that 600-year period that they were living in the community, unfortunately, not a single piece of writing exists that comes down to us that was written by the hand of a Skellig monk. So actually, historically, we have not got a massive amount of information about this place. We have a few snippets of information that come from other monasteries of the time where writings did survive, and they simply tell us the names of some of the abbots who would have lived in this community and the years in which they died. So we're told of a man named Blommuck living here, another man named A, another man named Flan. There was a Swivna or Sweeney in English of Skellig living here. And we are also told of 3 Viking raids that occurred on the island in the 9th century. And it's not surprising to see the Vikings attacking this spot, because the monastery had enough to entice the raiders. They would have had any foodstuffs that they were trying to store to get them through the winter time. That was valuable enough to come and attack for. But also people. The Vikings were slavers, and they would have taken the monks themselves if they could get their hands on them. And we know from time to time that they actually tried to target abbots and important holy men to try and get a ransom for them. So we know of 3 attacks here, but in 823 we're actually told that they carried off the abbot, who was a man named Ekgal, and they starved him to death. So it was a tough old time for probably only one generation of men surviving these Viking attacks. And because of them, we believe they built for themselves a little refuge on the south peak of the island. So today you climbed up into an area which we called Cry Saddle, which was between the 2 peaks before you took the last flight of steps to reach the monastery up here. If you look across at the other peak, it's higher up than this one. And at the very top up there, the monks built for themselves very small terraces, much, much smaller than this, and they wrapped them around the top of the peak over there. And up there, they had little beehive huts, they built even a little chapel. What you're looking over at is the actual wall of the oratory or chapel on the south peak when you look at it from Cry Saddle. And they also even had basins that they cut directly into the cliff face to collect water. So they could go up there if this place was under attack, And if the Vikings were trying to starve them out from over there, they were able to survive for long periods of time. It's very difficult to reach that peak. It's obviously closed to the public today. It's not safe. It's almost a vertical cliff climb in order to reach it. And so one person just throwing rocks down could defend it very, very easily. You have to pass through a section, which is a chimney of rock that runs for about 4 meters. And the monks hollowed out the central part of that. And you have to pull yourself up through that. So it's really quite impossible, if someone doesn't want you to get up there, for you to get up there. So it was a safe haven in times of attack from Vikings. And then after the threat of the Vikings dissipated, we believe it was probably used as a kind of a hermitage. So if you didn't have enough peace and tranquility at this side of the island, you could spend a little time over on the south peak of the island. And roughly around this time, what they did is they built these amazing prayer terraces on the far side of that peak. And their prayer terraces run for about 3 to 4 meters in length, about 1 meter wide, and have a very low wall around them. And the floor of the prayer terrace is covered in a very special white rock called quartz. Now, quartz is the white stone you see beneath my feet here, and it is found on the island, but because of its colour, it's associated with purity. Skellig, because 2 lighthouses were built on the far side of the island. And along with those lighthouses was accommodation for the keeper and their families. So there was a lot of children born and raised on the Skellig for a long time. And in fact, at one point there were so many children here, they actually brought a school teacher from Portmagee out to teach the kids. So they had their own story on the island. And they used the different structures up here that the monks had. They would have used this building right here, which was the main chapel or oratory that the early Christian monks used. They've whitewashed the inside of that, and they built a little altar in there, and they used that for their Sunday service. And you might also notice as you climb down back into Christ's Saddle, some of the steps that the monks had have been turned upright. And they tried to create a little field there, and believe it or not, they walked a cow up the steps you came up today, and they tried to keep a cow in that central area, but this is not a great environment for cows, so the cow thing was abandoned pretty quickly. But they did very successfully introduce rabbits to the island. So you might see lots of little fluffy tails around the place bouncing around. They introduced them as a food source, and of course they took to the place really, really well. And everybody notices a very poignant reminder of the life of those keepers when they look at what looks like a modern grave in St. Michael's Chapel just here. If you read the inscription on that grave, it's actually dedicated to 2 very young boys. And they were a lighthouse family that were living out here during the winter months. And there was a flu-like illness in that family. And within 3 months, 2 of the young boys had passed away, and they had to be laid to rest here because they couldn't get them ashore at the time. Apparently there was actually a 3rd child sick in that family, but they were able to save his life, and they did manage to get ashore eventually. But it's a reminder of the lifestyles of the lighthouse people on the island. Now, of course, today there's only one functioning lighthouse, and it's automated, so nobody lives here full-time anymore. Now, I'm going to very quickly run you through the actual buildings up here in the monastery so that you know exactly what you're looking at. I'm standing in the heart, the central part of the monastery. This is the oratory that the monks would have gathered in to pray and to worship. And their day was divided into strict times of prayer, the hours they were called. And this is where they would have gathered. The very first beehive then is the largest, and it was used as a kind of a kitchen, if you like, a communal area that they would have cooked and get together in. It's also very close to the water cistern just outside. And then St. Michael's Chapel is this building right here, which was built in the 9th century, and it was built to mark the island becoming associated with St. Michael the Archangel. The island became associated with St. Michael because the warriors themselves would have identified, the monks themselves would have identified with the warrior saint. So they would have seen themselves out here up in a high place, fighting for the souls of the people on the mainland. And of course it's a coastal location, and St. Michael is often associated with coastal locations on high points. You see the same thing at Mont Saint-Michel in France and St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall as well. So this chapel was built to mark that dedication. And it's very different to everything else. It would have been plastered originally and had a thatched roof, but it's the only one that has imported stone. So there's green sandstone in the corners of this brought from Valencia, just to make it a bit more special when you bring the rock from somewhere else. All the rock from everything else is from the island here. But it's also the only one that has mortar between the stones holding it together. So every other piece of construction on the island that you're looking at that the monks built is of dry stone masonry. It's a technique called corbelling, which was well known in this country. It goes back to very early times. The Neolithic people would have used it in their burial monuments. But it's a technique whereby you knit the stone together, and it's a balancing act of stone being knit together and create. You move upwards and upwards till you get these little dome shapes, and they survive really well because they're very flexible. When this is a man-made terrace, there's a lot of moving and shifting repeatedly, over time with gravity and settling. But they allow for that movement, and they readjust themselves, and they still hold their shape really well. Whereas this particular structure, because of its mortar, is very rigid and simply fell into ruin very, very quickly. Now there's another oratory on the far over terrace. It's close to the public, so we ask you not to climb into that terrace, but do have a look at it over there. It was built again in the 9th century, and then behind that particular structure is what looks like a very tiny beehive. And that was what the monks called the necessarium, which maybe some of you are still looking for today. It's the toilet. It was an upright slab, and gravity did the rest. And it's located over there on the far over side. And then if you've walked around this section already, you'll notice there's a raised bed with 2 small rows of crosses on it. And that was the graveyard section where they were burying the people who passed away in the community. But they would have also used all around the oratory here, all around the chapel. And from the excavation...
Foto gemacht hat, das sieht voll geil aus. Die meisten was hängt.
And there is 75,000 gallons here for this public property. They come here in March, and they have their little chicks here on up the ledges then. And if we're here now in May, the best completely snow-capped. All around them, both sides, everywhere is snow-capped completely. And there's so many gallons up here, there's room. But then, after their chicks, yeah, I do that now. After they have their chicks then, when they get big, they will throw them out into the water and they have to learn to fly off the water. So the gannet cannot fly off the land, he flies off on the ledge and he can fly off the water. So they migrate away then. This time of the year, September, and by October there's very few birds left behind unless they're sick or they old. They live to be about 40. So they come back again the next year then and they meet up with the same bird. They're very